for tonight, I wasn't actually sure we were going to have a group tonight because I didn't really have a message up until like a couple days ago. And the thing of it was that like the thing that God laid out for me was in particular this thing that's kind of been in my purview for a while, and it's been at kind of a point of frustration, but there's kind of the greater scheme of it. And one of the things that like I could talk about, anxiety and depression and and fear. And we will talk about those because they're part of this, but they're kind of under a grander umbrella as far as what specifically was brought up to my attention again and again here. So, essentially, the message tonight is about stagnation and about the concept of that and what it looks like. More than that, how incredibly destructive it is to us as people in general. Like, whether you believe in God or not, it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, when you sit someplace and fester, it will inevitably destroy you. Like, the interesting thing is, when you look at it, even from one kind of analog that I was given to look at, is when you think about it in biology and study ecosystems, you find that, a stream has a continuous source of water constantly pouring through. It's always moving. And there are pools here and there, but at the end of the day, the water is always going. And the thing that you find when you study the composition of the water is the level of oxygen in it, and just how healthy those ecosystems usually are. In Oregon, we maybe take it for granted because a lot of us are born and raised around it. But when you've been to a place like Texas, fittingly, or Minnesota, you go to places where it's just dead. The water is stagnant. It smells. You can't drink it. It will kill you. The animals around it, like, you'll find all kinds of animals, but they're all things that are eating each other or trying to decompose the waste that this is. And it's not a healthy environment. In a sense, you could argue that it's healthy for what it is, but in general, from the perspective of being a human being trying to live around something like that, it's bad. I mean, if you can't swim in the water because it's going to do physical harm to you, parasites are going to burrow into your skin, or chemicals in it are going to do something to you, or if you accidentally drink some, you'll spend 3 days in the hospital. That's bad. That's not conducive to our existence. And the truth is that some of those places get so bad that it's not conducive to any existence. Because even for those ecosystems, when you look at like a marsh or something like that, they do get to points where the water is so bad it kills everything. And that's the kind of the thing to look at. The difference between that movement, even though there are places to rest, and just how healthy it is, versus when it sits and festers and grows. And the reason why we talk about this is not to talk about ecology, but in fact to talk about the heart and soul of the individual and exactly where this takes us. The thing of it is that we've spent a few weeks talking about a lot of different things pertaining to despair and addressing kind of the issues in ourselves and different things like that. We always are talking about the issues within ourselves and dealing with them, and how important that is, how invaluable it is, and this is why. See, if you look at yourself from the perspective of, the human being that you are, and even more than that, maybe who you could be. And that's not necessarily looking at it from the perspective of being somebody else entirely, but being the best interpretation of yourself. You know, we all have flaws, we all have strengths, we all have different things, and a lot of us have vices. And the truth is, most of us want to be rid of those vices. Some of us justify them and stand by them and say, well, actually, I'm perfectly okay with this, and I should be, and everyone else should be okay with it, even though it's completely toxic to the world around you and to the people around you, and it damages your relationships, causes you to be unable to understand other relationships and the micro transactions and that happen in our society, and the way that it creates a paradigm where people don't want to be around you or want to move away from you, and just how caustic that can all be. You still want to keep them for some reason. The thing is that the thing about it is that we, even though there may be those things, those vices, most of us are aware and most of us want them gone. But we can't do that when we're justifying them. And we can't do that when we make excuses for their existence. Even more than that, though, we can't do it when we believe more in them than in ourselves. And especially when we believe in them more than we believe in God. And that's a big thing, because the truth is that a lot of us live reactive lives. Most of us don't spend a lot of time feeling through things or addressing the kind of issues that are arising in us. The reality is that a lot of us don't want to. And like, the frustrating thing for Christians is that God's really big about drawing us closer to Him. And in order to draw us closer to Him, He's going to want to deal with things that cause us to drift away from Him. Because I don't know if you've ever been in a relationship where the other person keeps finding reasons and excuses to not be around you, but it makes it really hard to have a relationship when the other person doesn't want to be around you. It doesn't work. It eventually ends, painfully often. And at the end of the day, the only way that that can be addressed is when you start finding out what it is that's making them drift. Maybe it's stuff inside of them. You know, I've shared about past relationships of mine, and I had one that was like that, where, you know, our entire relationship was kind of a lie. And she, you know, she came at it saying that she loved me and all these other things, but in reality, the only reason why she got together with me was because of peer pressure from her parents. And, you know, so I was there trying to keep this relationship going, not understanding what was going wrong and thinking that it was me, and then being blamed for it because she couldn't just admit what was really going on. And, you know, at the end of the day, that caused me a lot of damage, internally, emotionally. And it wasn't until later on, when her and I were able to talk again, that I was able to get the truth out of her about it and find out that, oh, this is actually what it was. That the whole time you never actually wanted to be in a relationship with me because you just didn't want to be in a relationship in general. But you did it because of this other thing. And I use that example because it's indicative of how we kind of progress with God in a lot of ways. And it's not just God either. Like, we do this with other relationships, we do this with each other. Sometimes we do this with ourselves, where we'll detach from we will not address ourselves because we don't want to feel that. We don't want to be involved in that. We want to just push forward and go on. And the thing about it is that each time that you do that, you're going to run into this wall, and you're going to have to jump over it, or you can avoid it. But it's going to be painful every single time you run into it. And you have to make that decision. Will I go over this, or will I try to avoid it? But you're going to keep running into it again and again and again. Because that's the thing about this stuff, is it doesn't go away. Just because you pretend that you're better. You know, I'll use pride as the example because we've been talking about it a lot over the last few weeks. It's purely for the purpose of giving one example. You know, if you're somebody that carries a lot of pride, you can make a lot of decisions that are very selfish and very destructive for the people around you and completely justify it. And as a result, you're going to keep hurting people. But the thing of it is if you're the kind of person that carries that, you may not recognize, if you don't face it for what it is and acknowledge it for what it is, you're going to keep hurting the people around you, and you're going to keep finding yourself rejected. And you're going to keep being rejected, you're going to keep being abandoned by people, and you're going to think it's them. And that's the thing, is like, because you're not seeing because you are not seeing the factor that's existing in every single one of these situations, you keep repeating the same mistake. And that rejection and abandonment is going to grow and fester and develop another problem. And then bitterness comes in, and suddenly isolation, and then all the various damages that come from bitterness and isolation. It's just the nature of what happens when we begin to stagnate. We stay in one place, we stick with one festering problem, and as a result of that, it begins to cause more and more damage. And pride's one, but I think the best one to talk about for tonight, because it's the one that was brought up to me, is fear and anxiety. No pair of things are more likely to put you in that place than fear and anxiety. Because with both of those things, they cause you to continuously make the decision to not move. You can keep going with pride. You'll keep finding new relationships, you'll keep trying to make new friends, you'll keep building new communities, getting new jobs, you'll keep moving because you think that you're good enough. Pride doesn't blind you or doesn't stop you from moving so often. Fear and anxiety do. The fear of moving forward will hold you in one place over and over and over again. And the thing about fear is that it's really easy to justify. See, we don't often like to admit that we're scared. We like to find reasons to believe that we're actually completely confident and culpable, and we have everything under our control. Because at the end of the day, we do two things. One, we try to control everything around us. Problem number one. Problem number two is we also do a lot of deluding ourselves. Again, basic psychology, one of the first things they talk to you about is, along with people's memories, is their tendency to delude themselves. We're really good at it. We're really good at finding reasons for why things are okay, even though they're really not, and why we're okay doing them, even though we're really not. So when something comes up that scares us, we might have that initial response of, oh, that scares me, but then it's like, no, I'm not actually scared of that. I'm good. I just don't want to do it. And we'll find all kinds of other reasons for why we don't want to do it. And I have kind of a weird example of this from the scriptures to look at. But and that would be Jonah. A lot of us are familiar with the story of Jonah in terms of Jonah and the whale, or big fish, or whatever your interpretation tells you. Jonah was given a word about the city of Nineveh in Assyria, and he he took, and what he did was he was given this word, and then God told him to go to Nineveh and share this message. So Jonah's response was to run away. He didn't want to do it. And the thing was that God sent a storm to the boat that he was on, and he had the people throw him over the water. Not a particularly scared response. He understood that God wasn't going to kill him. But the thing was that after Jonah finally agreed to go, he goes to Nineveh and he shares exactly what God told him to say. All these harsh words that God had given him about what was coming to the city of Nineveh. And the people of Nineveh changed. In chapter 3 of the book of Jonah, you find out that Jonah went and did what he was told to do. It took 3 days to visit the entire city. And on the first day, Jonah went out and proclaimed the words of God. And the people of Nineveh, they repented. They turned from their ways. But mind you, key point is that it was a 3-day thing to get through the city of Nineveh. Jonah did day 1. And this was the response. The people of Nineveh were just like, oh no, we're bad. Like, okay, we're going to change. We're going to try to make ourselves right with God. So they do. And starting in, at the end of chapter 3, it says, when God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, he had compassion and did not bring upon them the destruction he had threatened. Starting in chapter 4, but Jonah was greatly displeased and became angry. He prayed to the Lord, "O Lord, is this not what I said when I was still at home? That is why I was so quick to flee to Tarshish. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live." But the Lord replied, "Have you any right to be angry?" Jonah went out and sat at a place east of the city. There he made himself a shelter, sat in its shade, and waited to see what would happen to the city. And we'll stop there. Jonah ran because he was afraid that that the people of Nineveh would turn from evil and be saved from the destruction that God had told him he would bring on these people. And he was afraid that when they repented, God would show them grace. And that's what upset him so much. There's a lot to unpack there, but it's kind of a weird example of somebody being afraid. And the point is that fear doesn't always look just like being afraid of the consequences to yourself. It's much broader than that. And that's the thing. That's why it's so easy for us to justify. My fears are that these things are going to happen. And that's when we get into the realm of anxiety. Because a lot of anxiety comes from a collection of different fears that all group together and cause you to not believe in yourself, to not believe in situations, and will move you towards despair. Anyway, the thing with Jonah, first off, was looking at the reality of how he responded to this. God sent him to the city to have a great thing happen. These people were to be saved from destruction, and Jonah discerned that he believed that they did not deserve that, and he was afraid that God would take him there and have him do this. It's really messed up in retrospect. And that goes back to a lot of like pride and a lot judgment and so many different things that we could cover at length. But for purposes of keeping this somewhat short and to the point, he was willing to rebel against God in order to avoid this. And on that first day, after seeing what happened, he bailed on the city and decided to go sit outside of it and wait for something bad to happen to the city. When God, in his intention, was intending to see the city saved. So Jonah was going to go out and pout, in a sense. So, on those subjects of fear and anxiety, these are the two things that will stop us from moving. Whether it's fear, and its many, many forms, any kind of thing that puts us in a place where we're going to run from responsibility, to avoid things that could hurt us, to avoid things that do hurt. Fear takes a lot of different forms. And because we don't feel scared, we can say that we're not afraid. When in reality, that's not always the case. Sometimes there are ways that we fear things where it doesn't look like being scared, it's just this deeper thing. You don't want it to happen, you're anxious about it, you have doubts, or you've just never seen it happen before. It's not comfortable. It's not that you're scared, it's uncomfortable. But at the end of the day, the internal reaction is still fear. You fear the unknown. So as a result of that, you might make decisions, you might choose to stay right where you are. And comfort ultimately is one of the greatest enemies of growth. Personal growth, spiritual growth, any kind of growth you want to talk about, comfort has its place, and it's all well and good. It's a good place to rest, but you can't stay there. You will have to move into places of discomfort in order to develop as a human being. It doesn't matter what you believe, that's going to be real life, every time. The thing of it is, too, is that when we talk about anxiety, which is this greater thing, anxiety is a monster. And it'll tear down every bit of hope that you have. It'll tear apart your belief in yourself. It'll tear apart your belief in God. It'll tear apart your belief in people. It'll tear apart so many different facets of what you move forward in. Any kind of semblance of peace that you have, anxiety is the enemy of peace. And it will tear that down, strip it, and scatter it, and leave you with little pieces that you have to try to grasp at to try to feel like you can move forward in life. And that's the thing, is a lot of us, like in our culture nowadays, I remember seeing a thing not too long ago talking about like millennials specifically are some of the least mentally healthy individuals in terms of generations. They carry more issues with anxiety than most, and it's not just millennials in that thing. There's also another study that I was reading not long ago where it was talking about how there was an increase in anxiety in our culture at large that was happening more and more with time. As the years progress, as things start moving faster, as there's more people, as there's more everything. Rather than life becoming easier, we've instead become more anxious, which is kind of the antithesis of everything that we set out to do in so many ways. We tried to make life more convenient, and instead it went the other way. So a lot of people struggle with anxiety specifically. And the thing about anxiety is that it doesn't play off of what's right in front of you. It plays off of what could happen with the things in front of you. Oftentimes by using your past and your experiences as a jumping off point in order to destroy your future. You have a decision in front of you. It involves making a change in your life. It's difficult, but you really do have all the equipment to do it. Like, you are strong enough, smart enough, you have the constitution, you are a good enough person to do this. But what about in the past? What about that one time when you made that one decision? What about how that didn't work out? What about that one time when all those people turned on you? What about that one time when you were so completely wrong and you thought you were right? And that's the point. That's the way it works. And I'm just throwing out a couple little base examples, but that's the beginning of it. And it has so much more ammunition to work with, and it's always personal to each individual. It's going to pull apart your experiences, and not just your own, not just things that you've done, but things that other people have done to you, things that were beyond your control, and use those to try to scare you. And that's where, and all of it is intended to make you stay right where you're at. And then what's more is then you feel guilty and ashamed because you didn't do the thing. The smallest, most easy thing. You know, you're trying to apply for a new job, but you psych yourself out. And then you punish yourself for it. It's a vicious cycle. And a lot of us go through it. And then what's more is the longer that we stay there, the worse it gets. Again, it's that stagnation thing where it just becomes this cycle and continues to destroy and decompose you. Like, the anxiety gets the better of you and you make the decision, and then you're ashamed that you made the decision, and then the anxiety uses that to add on to the next thing, and you feel ashamed again, and it just builds and builds and builds and builds and builds until finally you forget how to people. Suddenly you can't go out of the house. Suddenly you're like a shut-in. Suddenly you're afraid to talk to people.
Sorry. When you feel like that.
Yeah. It's just this thing that happens, and it actually happens to a lot of people. You know, it's a funny thing because there are a lot of people who, when you look around the room, you might see a lot of people who are very strong in their convictions or their purposes. But I can promise you that every single person in this room has had more than their fair share of occasions where something has come up and anxiety has gotten the better of them. And they won't talk about it because they're ashamed of those times. I know for myself, I oftentimes have to throw myself out here as the sacrificial lamb, be vulnerable and share my life experiences and the deep discomfort of being the thing that gets to act as the example and be judged pretty thoroughly. It's fine, I'll do it.
I actually thought for a second you'd go but this time I got somebody else. Oh crap.
And it's Jeremy tonight. No.
Again? Special guest, Jeremy.
Hey,
No.
I got issues.
It doesn't change. You know, there are plenty of occasions where I've, oftentimes, most of my friends and family know me to be somebody that's often fearless in the face of things that have to be done or handled or whatever. If there's a confrontation, I'll usually handle it. Different things like that. But there are more than enough occasions where my own anxiety has gotten the better of me and has been frustrating. You know, I can remember one example. This is a light one, only because it's the only one coming straight to mind, not because I want to avoid the heavier topics. But this one I remember specifically was God gave me a word to go pray for this family who are friends of mine at church. That was it. Just go pray for them. Bless them. And I sat there and then I thought about it. And I was like, well, is that really God? Am I really supposed to go do that? I feel awkward now. Why am I doing this? And I went back and forth on this whole thing until finally the time for prayer passed and somebody else got up and prayed for them while I sat there and watched. And after the fact, I sat there and was like, why did I do that? This was a really easy thing. This is a family that I've known for a while. They're good friends of mine. Why did I have a hard time standing up and going over to just pray for them? That doesn't make sense. I would have done this normally. Like, if nobody had told me to go do it, I would have done it anyways. But it was almost like having somebody put it forward allowed the opportunity for my anxiety to get the better of me and leave me stuck there. And what's dumb about it is, like, for me as a person, the little things are actually more shameful than the big things. Like, I can find reasons for why, like, having that really hard talk with that person about, you know, their drug addiction or their whatever is hard to do. But when it's something really easy like this, that's pathetic. Oh my gosh. I will be harder on myself over that because it's so small. You know, it's just one of those things. And the other side of it is, like, harder examples that do come to mind here are times when it's been going to talk to people about conflicts that we've had. There are people in my life right now who, if I saw them on the street right now, I don't think I'd be able to go and talk to them in terms of having a fruitful conversation and trying to resolve the conflict that exists between us. Instead, I would probably just be like a complete ass to them, or I just avoid them because I don't want to be a complete ass. That's just not becoming as somebody that's supposed to be leading a church group. It's one of those types of deals where, like, there's a very, very real conflict here that, you know, requires somebody asking for forgiveness. And neither party wants to do that because both of us are too justified to. And even so, there's that anxious part of it and fearful part of it that says, well, what happens if? And there's a lot of ifs. So the thing of it is like, those are some examples of things that I've got that I can bring up to bear and say, you know, this is where fear and anxiety has stopped me, as well as pride, because that's part of it too. Part of it standing on the injustice that I feel as a result of their actions. And I don't feel it's my place to go reach out, it's their place to reach out and apologize. And that's not actually conducive in these particular instances to creating resolution of conflict. And I understand that. So it's one of those things where we have this kind of stuff that's buried underneath the surface. It stops us from moving. And, you know, just to further use myself as an example here, the thing that I recognize is that with those individuals and that particular story, you know, it's a great breeding place for things like bitterness, anger, hatred. Unforgiveness is a fantastic place to sit with those kinds of feelings, especially when you sit back and, like, play back memories of what happened and what they did, and remember how justified they were, or how unrepentant they were, or how assured they were that what they were doing was right, even though what they were doing was categorically, objectively wrong. They still found grounds for it in order to pretend that they were on the right side of this. So as a result of that, when you play it all back, think about it, mill on it, you know, it can really, like, deepen the pit inside your heart and really cause a lot more anger and frustration And eventually that starts to seep into your person. Like, you start to become an angrier person. You start to become a more bitter person, and that starts to shade your view of other people around you. Jonah, where he was at, that's not something that just came about, okay? We talk about, like, it's easy to stand back and say he was being judgmental, he was being self-righteous, but in real life, we have things like that where we feel like we're right. We have things like that where other people have hurt us, and then we wish to visit pain and judgment upon them. And I understand that there are some people that have done really, really, really bad things. I do. But I also understand what mercy and grace look like, and exactly how far that goes, and how important that is, and how important it is for us as individuals to forgive. Because otherwise we find ourselves in this place where things start dying. And that's going to be us. Like, I can find all the reasons in the world to stay right where I'm at. Trust me. I fight with this all the time and think about it a lot. And I know that I'm wrong. And at some point, when we understand that we're wrong, whether that's judgment, whether that's anxiety, whether that's fear, pride, whatever issue it is that's causing you to sit and rot, there comes a point where we have to recognize what it is and begin to rebel against it. See, there's an interesting thing here with Jonah. Like, he illustrated an example of rebellion. And I feel like, oftentimes rebellion gets a bad rap. Because in the Bible specifically, it's oftentimes used as a derogatory thing. Like, they were in rebellion against God, therefore he punished them. They were in rebellion against God, therefore they would be cast into the lake of fire, all these different things. But we forget sometimes that God also is the one that created such concepts. The idea of rebellion is turning your back on something that's there. And sometimes that thing that you're rebelling against is something that's bad. You think about in World War II, when the Nazis occupied the French resistance continued fighting, rebelling against German rule. Even though their nation had accepted it, the French people in this group would not. And they would continue to fight, and they would continue to rebel. And the same is true with so many different situations and so many different circumstances. And sometimes that place to rebel is against ourselves and against the standards that we settle on. The kind of status quo that we're willing to accept. And I think a great example of something to rebel against is anxiety. Like, if I recognize that anxiety is something that's actually crept up and is now, causing me to stop, I've learned from experience that the best response to that is to say, okay, yeah, I'm being anxious right now, so I'm just going to go do this thing, despite myself. Sometimes we have to do that, and it's not comfortable, and everything inside of you is screaming not to do it, but you do it anyways. Because otherwise, you just do that same little cycle of shame and guilt and anxiety, and then shame and guilt and anxiety, and then shame and guilt and anxiety. It's either you do that, or you recognize the pattern and break it. And when you've broken it, you stand in a place where, yeah, it's uncomfortable, and yeah, it might actually go really, really bad, but at least you tried. And that's what's important. And it's not the kind of thing where if it goes bad, you should say, well, look, I didn't get what I wanted. I'm never going to do that again. Back to my anxiety cycle. It's the kind of thing where you celebrate the fact that you tried And even though it didn't work, you did what you were supposed to do. You gave it your best, because again, one of the things that we've talked about in this group and has been a reoccurring message here and there is sometimes giving it your best does not win you the day. Sometimes you do your best and you still lose. All that really matters is that you tried. You gave it your best. There's a lot more value in that than there is not trying because you know it's hopeless. Conserving your energy or yourself or whatever. Sometimes you're just going to actually do more damage to yourself by opting to stay put. So, and this is the thing, is I say all this knowing that in many, many occasions, God, we say this line all the time, that God is not a respecter of persons. And I don't know if that really applies, but it's there. And the truth is that when we look over the scriptures, the rest of the story of Jonah, he walks off, goes and sits in his little shelter, and God provides him a vine that gives him some shade. And then God kills the vine. Effectively, how do we put this? He flexed and, came after Jonah about what he was really doing. He gave him the rest, but then also tried to get him up and moving again. And that was the point. Oftentimes you'll find that God challenged his people to move, to believe. And that's not just God in the Old Testament. You'll find that Jesus many, many times challenged his disciples. He challenged the Pharisees. He challenged other people around him on a routine basis. Because see, the thing about it is again, God is the one who understands better than us, especially that particular concept about comfort. And about how if you stay there, you'll simply become stagnant. How many people do that, where the fear of losing their comfort means that they will give up basic human rights? Oh my gosh. There's something that Heather's counselor actually said in reference to that concept, that he read this thing and it was explaining how the best way to control a population is to provide them shelter, a stipend, and something else. And once those basic needs are met and they feel comfortable, you can be the most tyrannical monster possible and they'll accept it because they're afraid of losing those basic things. And that's how we end up in these places where we begin to get stuck and stagnate. Like we lose ourselves and our own identities all the time as a result of our fear of losing what makes us comfortable. So there's a place for us to, even the act of repentance is an act of rebellion against the very nature of where your soul has found itself being. I'm in a place of sin. I don't want to be. I'm in a place that puts me in opposition to God. That might not even necessarily be sin. I would argue that it's not a sin to be depressed, but your depression can easily become the kind of thing that that moves you into those places of fear and anxiety. Depression can easily be the kind of thing that makes you look at God and say, I don't believe you. So in that, it can create strife between you and God, even if it's not necessarily a sin. But it's the kind of thing where sometimes we do have to rebel against that, because repentance is the act of turning our backs on what we've been and what we've been doing and where we've been and going in the opposite direction. So it's important for us to take control of this and make the decision that we're going to be the ones to determine that, instead of being completely victimized by our circumstance or by our experiences. This is a place where we can meet God and move with Him instead of hiding. The story of Adam and Eve is always an interesting one, because it was the fall of man came, and Adam and Eve had been naked the whole time. They take a bite of the fruit, and then they're hiding from God. All that time, however long it was, didn't matter. They'd been nude the whole time, but suddenly they had shame now. Now they had it. So they were hiding from God, and he asked, "Why are you hiding?" And they're like, "Because we're naked." And his only response was, "Who told you were naked? Who told you that you weren't good enough? Who told you that you couldn't be seen?" And they believed that. Countless experiences beforehand didn't matter, because now this was what was at the forefront of their minds. And for us as individuals, we don't have the luxury, usually, of vast experience with God. We have a lot of life and a lot of experiences and a lot of pain and a lot of fear and a lot of doubt and a lot of unknown ahead of us. And a lot of us try to control that unknown by either looking at the past or looking at what's in front of us and trying to control that as much as we can to make that unknown go away and be as clear as possible. And the reality is that for us as followers of God, we need to become comfortable with the unknown, being unknown. Like, just being real here for a minute and standing in who I am. I'm somebody that God has given a lot of information about the future to. He's told me many, many things at different times, but that doesn't mean that I know. He might tell me one event, but I have no idea how we're getting there. I've no clue. And it would be foolish of me to try to pretend like I do, and it would be more foolish of me to try to build in a plan for getting there, when that's not my job. It's just a glimpse of something that's going to happen. So even when you've got God showing you future events, you still don't know the whole future. And it would be foolish of you to believe otherwise. And if you don't have God doing that, even more the case. You don't have control over it. But the thing to know is that with God, He's going to protect you and preserve you all the way. And that future is going to be fine. And that's where faith comes in, and that's why it's so important here. And sometimes maintaining faith means rebelling against your own anxiety and doubts and fears. Yeah. And that's what I've got.